I'm Mary Ann Nathan. I'm the Naturalist, and it's such a great opportunity to partner with Merrymeeting Adult Education and have our resident Nathaniel Wheelwright here tonight to talk. And with that, I did want to let you know that we are offering this partnership with Merrymeeting Adult Education, and it's a good way, I think, for them to get out into the community and let people know what's going on. So without any further ado, Matt, do you want to start?
Great, thank you very much. How many people are members, by the way, of the Hartsville Heritage Trust? Great. It's such a great organization. We live just down the road, and we have Wilson Cove and Widgeon Cove and Otter Brook all surrounding the bed. And every single one of the reserves is fantastic. So kudos to this organization. So it's a real pleasure to give a talk tonight, and a real pleasure to do it in person. I've given a couple of Zoom talks over the last couple of years, and I finally said, you know, I'm done with Zoom talks, so find somebody else if you want a Zoom talk. We've opened 2 windows, and we have a super duper air purifier in the back, so we should be good, and if not, hopefully everybody's vaccinated and boosted, and it'll be okay. Anyways, it's great just to be in person again, and to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, and I know it is to a few people I know here, and I suspect to most of you who've taken the trouble to come here tonight, about how to be a naturalist and how to maybe improve your skills as a naturalist, how to become more observant, and how to do it during the digital age, which is so distracting. You are looking at one of the last people on earth who's never owned a cell phone of any kind. But I have to confess, I borrow my wife's occasionally for something I'll talk about a little bit later. So I'm not anti-technology at all, maybe a little bit. But I look for ways to remove things between me and nature. And so what I hope to do is to give you maybe some actual tips that you can use to become an expert about natural history in your own backyard. And I'm going to promote a book that I wrote with a natural history writer, Baron Heinrich, who probably a number of you have read his 20 or 30 books. So we've got our book already. And I'll explain where this book came from. But I'll also tell you that you don't need to buy a book like this in order to use this system. You can do it on your computer with sort of a matrix spreadsheet. That's actually how I started. In fact, it's what I continue to do because I'm sort of used to a slightly different format. Happy at any time to take any questions along the way, so I'd love to kind of make this a little bit more conversational. Maybe I'll dim the lights a bit too.
Probably that
I can put anybody to speak if I do that. So I need
No, very good.
Okay. So we are in a world of technology, and people my age love to tell super boring stories about people they saw not ignoring their children and being on there, you know, then they were like this, and we grumble and grumble. But in fact, that's really not the right way to think about it. It was a Bowdoin student, as a matter of fact, who was Liam Taylor's, who read a draft of this book when I was first writing a chapter on it. And he scolded me for not so much criticizing the digital age, because I was smart enough to realize that there are lots of different perspectives, and that was maybe not the smartest argument. But he criticized me because I sort of began a chapter talking about my childhood and how wonderful it was, and we caught frogs, and we were, you know, parents didn't hover over us, and helicopter parents, all the rest. He basically said, you know, you just lost half your audience there. So I sort of switched it. I realized, yeah, we've got to be able to take what's good about technology and digital age. But that still doesn't stop me from complaining about a few things. So this is one thing I'll complain about. These are words that used to be in the Oxford Junior Dictionary. But space was limited, so they had to get rid of those words to make space for blog, voicemail, and cut and paste. But it's pretty frightening to think about a child who doesn't know what a fern is, or an acorn, or a pasture. So we need to find ways to connect with nature around us. So let me give my pitch for technology. If you haven't discovered iNaturalist, it is just such an extraordinary example of community science pooling millions of people's, I suppose, certainly hundreds of thousands of people's observations of millions of specimens. And it's all going into this database, and with machine learning and artificial intelligence, the things we can do now that I was told by specialists at Cornell, this is not going to happen. You're not going to be able to have a Shazam for birds. It's a software that can just hear a bird song and identify it.
Yeah.
Well, now we have it. Just, it happens so quickly. And not only that, but it can take a complicated soundscape in the spring and give you a list of birds.
Oh my gosh.
So these are just some of the really, truly amazing apps. I would particularly point out two, and many of you probably already have these on your phones or your devices, but if you don't, if you're interested in birds, Merlin is free from the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology, and it will allow you to identify bird songs in the field, and will also give you alternative, if you describe a particular bird, all you have to do is type in, actually I haven't looked at it in a while, so maybe it's more sophisticated than this, but you used to type in size, roughly, color, habitat, it knows where you are, so it knows the time of year, and it basically says what you probably saw, based on what you told me, is one of these 5 birds. And then you can explore those birds. But again, free and fantastic. Seek is the one, that's why I borrow my wife's cell phone, because if I want to learn some of the asters that are now blooming beautifully in the fields behind us, I can, if I'm in a rush, I just don't have time to go through the keys. Ideally, I would like to go through the keys. I learned an awful lot more doing it that way, but if I just need to know what that is and then maybe go straight to the description, you just point your phone at it. You don't even have to take a picture. It just thinks and says, I think what you've got is this. So a truly extraordinary advance. Having praised technology, let me say that, if you walk around with your cell phone like this, and that's the way you interact with nature, you miss the boat. There's so much more to it, and this is really it's not a barrier between you and nature, but it's a tissue layer of some kind that mutes some of the excitement about nature. And the other thing about it, I would say, if all you are using technology for is, give me the name of this, therefore I'm a naturalist, and you can point it at anything, do you really understand much about it? And I would say it's so much more satisfying when you understand the relationships between things. And so that's where your own observation and good old-fashioned studying, field guides, or some good websites is the way to go. So what I'll talk about as a way of becoming a better, more astute naturalist is nature journaling, and I'll describe in particular the method that I've used now for 30-odd years of making very rapid, kind of almost abbreviated notes about things that I see in a particular format that allows me to retrieve information really quickly. And that led, after about 25 years of doing it, to the publication of the Naturalist Notebook. And then I don't know if there's anybody here who's heard me talk about the first 2 things before. If so, don't worry, because the last part is a new project I'm working on. And it's something that you can do too, and probably some of the rest of you, some of you are doing already. I'm betting. But I'll leave you in suspense for a moment about how you can help preserve biodiversity. So after Barrett and I published our book, which has maybe 100 pages of text, and then 100 pages that is actually the reader's, the naturalist's book, where you put your own observations. Is after we finished this big project, I came upon this poem called Sometimes by Mary Oliver. Was such a lovely poet. And within that poem, she has essentially what our book is all about. She scooped us and did it so much more eloquently. And she has this instruction, what she calls instructions for living a life. Pay attention, be astonished, and tell about it. And that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today. I also thought I was going to be, had been scooped by Henry David Thoreau. I had, I think our book was almost, it was in manuscript form, it wasn't in galley proofs. When I came upon a table from one of his very late publications, he had, he wrote something like 2.5 million words in his journals. And he had a journal for every year. And he was a careful observer of nature, so embedded in his journal, or buried, I should say, in his journals by year, are some fantastic observations about natural history. But it was only really shortly before his death, like the late 50s, 1850s, after he had gotten inspired by Charles Darwin's publication of The Origin of Species, and he started to hang around with some biologists at the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard, and he realized, oh, I'm a great writer, a great poet, a great philosopher, a great naturalist, but I haven't really been able to synthesize what it is I've seen. And it's all stuck in all these journals, 2.5 million words worth. And that's what he realized, hey, why don't I put it into a spreadsheet? So this is actually a spreadsheet of Henry David Thoreau. And he's listed here, that's his original handwriting, different tree species, and then across the top, the years. And when I first saw it again, my heart just sort of stopped. I think, wait, that is our book. The axes are a little bit different, as you'll see. But the main point is, can you summarize something interesting, something that interests you about a species in nature, and in such a way that you can then scan your eyes across it and pull out patterns. So this is when trees and shrubs leafed, when they produce new leaves. So unfortunately, he didn't start this until late in his career. If he'd started 30 years earlier, he really probably would have taken maybe some different paths, maybe less interesting paths, I don't know. There are all kinds of books about how to keep a nature journal. And they're all wonderful in their own ways. But they have one thing in common, I think, which is that the emphasis tends to be on putting the information in or making a painting or a sketch, but not pulling information back out. So that part is somewhat missing, I would say. So here's a good example of a lovely book about how to be a nature journalist, complete with lovely watercolors. And I'm just going to zoom right in and show you there's actually some data in here as well, something that would teach you about the biology of things that you're interested in, like groundhogs. So there are actually 40 groundhogs. So that's kind of cool to know something about the population size of groundhogs. But the problem is, how would you kind of pull that information out? What would be the context for that? So a different approach was kind of suggested to me after getting a gift from my sister-in-law, Tori Stevens. And she designed, as far as I know, just by herself, what she called a 10-year gardening journal. And she gave it to me in 1989, and I quickly co-opted it and said, I can do a lot more than record when I planted potatoes or when I had the last corn or something like that, and started putting in natural history observations. And so this is the system that I've been using since 1989. And the idea is to have dates of the year across the top, and then different years down the vertical axis on the left-hand side. And so with just a glance, in this case of a 10 by 10, you can sort of anticipate what's happening in nature. You can pull out important dates, and you become not just smarter about those particular things, but it opens your eyes to other aspects of nature. So I did this for 20-odd years, and I thought, well, I could take one of my sabbaticals at Bowdoin College and write another scholarly paper that would be read by a small number of specialists. Or I could see if I could publish this idea, because I think anybody in the world can become an expert about nature in his or her own backyard. But I was experienced enough to know that it's not easy to find a publisher who will publish your work. So I thought, well, I know there's another way to do it, and that's get a famous person as your co-author. So I've known Baron Heinrich for many years. He lives off the grid. He's even more anti-tech, I guess, in his lifestyle than I am. And I approached him and said, I have a great idea for a book. It's going to turn on so many people to nature. If you want to join in, you don't have to do any work. And he said, I just need your name, is what I said to him. And he said, great, no work? Yeah, that sounds fine. Here he is, he's showing me a copy of his original childhood nature journal. And I didn't zoom in on it, but he's got observations of hawk nesting and how we can determine where they are in incubation. And it's cute because he's got all these misspellings, both because he's 12 years old and because he had only recently immigrated to Maine from Germany, where his family fled the warring factions in all directions, back and forth in Poland and Germany. So when I went to visit him, I said, okay, we got an agreement, this is great. I'm going to just cabin before, but I said, you know, one other thing, in some of your books you have some lovely black and white sketches that you've done. He's kind of a self-taught artist. Could we use some of those, do you think, for illustrations? And he said, sure, yeah, you'd be welcome to. He says, as a matter of fact, somebody just digitized some of my collections of art, and it's on his thumb drive. Nobody had ever seen it. I took the thumb drive back. Oh, here, sorry, I'm a little out of order. This is his journal here. Barred owl eggs ready to hatch, and red-shouldered hawk eggs slightly hatched, which is not quite the way he wanted to express it. He meant that that incubation had started, but he didn't have the word for it, so he said they're slightly hatched. No leaves on trees. Anyway, this is what I found in his thumb drive, 900 watercolors that had never been published before. So the combination of having Baron as co-author, having, I think, a pretty good idea for a book, and having these absolutely lovely illustrations made it very easy to find a publisher, and Story Publishing is the name of the publisher. And they really put their shoulder to it, I think, and had a great design team put together a very attractive book. So here's what it looks like. We dedicated the book to teachers, because we're both educators and taught for many years at University of Vermont. And as I mentioned, we're giving 100%, we've always given 100% of the royalties to conservation. Did I mention? I mean, not mention. 100% of the royalties to conservation and environmental education. So I'm giving it to Maine Audubon and the Organization for Tropical Studies, and Baron to the Forest Society of Maine. So here's what the book looks like. But as I say, you can go easily to your computer and make yourself your own spreadsheet and print it out. And it works just the same way, just get it spiral bound at Staples. In fact, I even have a YouTube of how to do it. It's kind of like steal this book idea. And it's one of the nature moments if you want to Google that and make your own natural history journal. And there's also some lovely interviews and footage with parents in that. So Story Publishing decided that either they would sell more books, or it's just simply more convenient to have fewer days. Instead of 10, it's 8. And instead of 10 years, it's 5 years. So we only have 40 observations that you can make and spread open page, but it's still enough to feel the rhythm of nature, whatever happens to interest you. I think they were also thinking that unless you're already, you're a dedicated naturalist, if you saw what I typically work on, which is a 10 by 10 grid, you might think, oh man, I'm never going to make it 10 years with this hobby. But I think you'll be surprised once you get going. I mean, I've seen a lot of people who've gotten quite excited about it. So these are some actual data that from my journal, and I transcribed them into the book, just to show what it looks like, and to show you, first of all, how easy it is, and to make several points. One, what I found, at least with myself, is that, and picture yourself when you had your first diary, if you had a diary when you were 11 or 12, and you sat down in the evening, and when summer vacation began, dear diary, here's what I did today, and these are the deep thoughts I've had. Anyway, you ran out of steam, right, after about a week or two, and you stopped doing it. You certainly didn't care, when school started, you didn't continue. So maybe the first tip I would have is, I'll summarize this later, but keep it brief. So you can see these are very short little notes that I make. And then I also circle things that I'm interested in. So yellow rump world. You can use a 4-letter code, which is typical among ornithologists, or make up your own code. In the back of the book, there's a glossary that you can define your own terms. What do I mean when I have an up arrow or I have an exclamation mark or something like that? Actually, so this is my signal for, oh my gosh. Or it's my signal for, I really did see that. I double checked it. So with one hand, while I'm eating a slice of buttered toast in the morning at breakfast, I can look out the window, see a yellow rump warbler, and take 12 seconds or less to write that down. And then, if I do this for 3 years, I start to realize, oh boy, next week is April 25th. I better be on the lookout because I think that's about when yellow rump warblers arrive. And that's very different from, say, blackpoll warblers. They're going to be about 2 or 3 weeks after that. And then you can get some devices that help you remember to look out for yellow rump warblers, and they happen to be yellow. And that's when I tend to see forsythia flowers. So when my first forsythia flowers, I think, oh, that yellow, oh, yellow rump warblers. Yes, sure enough, there's one singing in a tree. To show you how this can work, I had a funny thing happen when we were in Brunswick at the time, and I got a letter from our our Brunswick Times record carrier, and she was offering a prize of a year's subscription to their Brunswick Times record if you could guess when Baltimore Orioles first appeared in our backyard. That's easy. It's May 7th. As it turned out, I missed by a day because we had a bit of a storm, but I wasn't too far off. I thought it was going to be really simple. So these are data from my actual observations in my backyard. First frost dates and first snow dates. So take a look at those dates, by the way. Zero in on them. So 30 years ago, 30-odd years ago, it was routine. September 20th, September 11th. I remember snow and once around September 24th. And then in more recent years, this is what we're seeing. So you can actually make contributions in your own backyard towards verifying whether or not climate change is real, whether we're seeing warming. I think you persuade yourself that you're skeptical. Take data for 30 years and you'll be persuaded. I'm going to skip this. I'm going to save one of the points I want to make with this. I once got an email from someone who had bought the book. She lived in New York City, and she opened up the first chapter, and the first chapter said kind of what I've said to you, which is, it doesn't matter what you're interested in, you can become a naturalist, you can become, in fact, the world's expert in your backyard. Just open your eyes, focus in on something that interests you, and start. Don't invest a lot, don't worry if you skip a day or a week or a month. Just write down what you see when you feel like writing it down. She told me, so I know nothing about nature. I'm from New York City, but I wanted to learn more. So I thought, well, I'll start with the temperature. So every day she walked over to the thermometer and she recorded what the temperature was outside. She said, I did that for 2 weeks, and then I happened to be walking over to look at the thermometer, and she said, I heard a bird sing. She said, I've never heard a bird sing before. So it just sort of tuned up her sense of where am I in the world, am I present, am I listening, and am I being observant, am I part of nature? So what I've found is that by focusing in on things that interest me, the world that interests you gets bigger and bigger. And so I decided to learn about dragonflies, which I knew nothing about, and damselflies. And I decided to record when I saw them in my backyard. And this happened to be in Brunswick. and identify them and realize, oh boy, this is really cool. There are some interesting patterns that you see in dragonflies. And dragonflies, by the way, once birds become rarer and rarer and you don't hear them singing, but they're sort of a good backup for birds. They're colorful, they're territorial, they're active in the day. So you don't have to be totally despondent if birds disappear. Just switch to dragonflies. So here's something cool. Common green darner. Something I learned by starting with this simple analysis of my own data when I saw them. And they appeared, this figure doesn't totally show, but they actually are the very first dragonfly that you see. Anybody know why? This, by the way, it's a pretty big dragonfly. Males are they're blue and green. I think they're bluish in the head area and green in the back, but I put that first. And then the ones you see going over ponds. Anybody know why they show up first? They're the one species, or one of the very few anyway, in this list that's migratory. They're like birds. They actually come from the south. So they are different from all the rest, which appear once they've actually metamorphosed and left the water. They spend the winter as nymphs in your pond. So that was neat. And then the other thing is I now pay attention to these meadowhawks. They're the really companionable, small red dragonflies that will land on your knee if you're sitting by a pond in late October, early November. And they're the very last ones. So now I have something else to look at. So let me, yeah.
Can you tell me to know what one of the photographs was?
That was one of the darners. And this might be, I tell the truth, I'm a little rusty on it. It's either shadow darner or Canada darner.
I asked because we have a million days and days.
Yeah, well,
And they're large.
Yeah, so the big, large ones, and this is the time of year for them, by the way. And most of the darners are at the end of the season. I shall go back and look at that slide to verify. And what you have to look at is the pattern here, and I just can't remember the shadow versus Canada. They're about, there are probably 10 or so species that are super similar. But see, here they are. Canada darner, shadow darner, Windsor darner. They're all the late season darners. So if you can get it, well, they're hard to find perched, but if you can take out your butterfly net, you still have one around, catch it and photograph it, and then you'll be able to identify it. Or if you can look at it with binoculars and look for the pattern. So I'm going to quiz you all now, and if you've seen this quiz before, or if you're one of my former Bowdoin students, you can't speak up and answer this. So these are actual data from my backyard, with year down on the x-axis, so I just pulled this out. It took me about 10 minutes. And then the date that they appeared in different years. So what I want you to do is get your hypotheses generated in your head. What would you, if this was your data set, what would you conclude, what would you want to know, and then maybe what species you think is characteristic of this pattern? So how would you describe this? If you were on the telephone talking to somebody, hey, I'm looking at a slide, here's what it looks like. And the red line, by the way, is sort of the trend line. So what do you see? Someone tell me, make an observation about this.
They ebb and flow.
They ebb and flow, super, yeah. Meaning that 1 year is not a good predictor of the next year, something like that.
Yeah.
They're super variable, so that's a really important point. How about long-term trends? Do you see any long-term trends?
The fewer of them coming early.
So these are the early ones here, and late ones, and so I guess another way to ask that is what does that line look level to you, or does it look like it's tilted a little bit?
It's tilted.
So how would you interpret that in terms of this? What does that mean? What's happening today that was not happening 30 years ago?
You're just
They're coming earlier.
Earlier.
Yeah, okay.
That's
So-
why I said they
okay.
came earlier than later.
So you hit the main points that it's variable, or would you say top with ups and downs, and
Ebbs and
Ebbs and
flows.
flows, and they seem to be coming earlier. So, do you know what species that is? Think about it for a minute, and look at the second species from my journal. Same scale, by the way. The dates are a little bit different, but I scaled them identically. So how would you describe this? Regular, predictable, and a trend or not? Flat. Okay, you ready to guess what the two are? Two species?
So the first one is the robin.
Okay, so you think the first one was a bird, a robin. Other guesses?
In my backyard, I've got a pond, retention pond, and the mallards come pretty much the same time in the fall, and they leave about the same time in the spring for the females to brood and for the males to molt.
So they're pretty predictable.
They're pretty predictable.
I think, so you guys are on a little bit of a bird thing. So I'm gonna,
About monarch butterflies.
okay, butterflies. Who else might be variable? Butterflies would certainly be variable in terms of numbers of individuals, but why might butterflies?
Frogs. Amphibians.
Frogs are.
How about frogs?
They're very steady though. Oh, really?
Because it's one of the stuff.
If it's warm, if the ponds melt,
Yep.
because we've had a warm March, it started early. If we've had a cold one, they don't show up until mid-April. So there's basically a lot of biology that you can teach yourself in your own backyard. Their activity is not dependent on day length, it's dependent on how cold it is, whether they're surrounded by ice or not, and if the ice melts, then out they go. So plants, insects, amphibians, so-called cold-blooded animals and plants are much more likely to be variable from year to year, depending upon if it's cold spring or warm spring. Baltimore Orioles overwinter in Central America and North and South America. They get their cues from day length, and it's modified a bit by, as I found out when I didn't win the contest because there was a rainstorm, and I was off by a day or two, but basically they're pretty, day length is not going to change even though the world is warming.
So if you're trying to mark trends with regards to the environment behind it, then using those cold-blooded animals or plants is probably a better indicator than using something that relies on sunlight at a time of year.
So what a great point you just made here, because we went from looking in your backyard, recording what anybody can do. I hear, it's the first wood frogs. I'm going to write that down in while I'm having breakfast in my notebook. Then I pull it out, and I realize, actually I've learned something about biology here. Cold-blooded animals and plants are going to be much more variable. And now you've added up basically a policy application. So basically you've done exactly what Mary Oliver said, pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. And that's the tell about it part. So thank you for that. Great observation. So again, I'll summarize the book, kind of the 5 main points really, and I think I've hammered on them a little bit. Keep your records brief and easy. If you don't, and you're like me, or like most people, and you're a little bit lazy, or other things come up in your busy life, you're just not going to do it. I gave a copy of this book to my sister-in-law, and she showed me after a couple of weeks what she'd done, and each cell she'd made a lovely little colored pencil drawing of nature. And I said, don't do that. You're going to burn out. You won't be able to sustain that. That's just too much work. It's lovely. You can have your own book of nature sketches, cross-reference it, and write in your journal, page 12. And that's where you turn when you have the time to make a lovely drawing of a flower or something. But to try to squeeze that in, plus there isn't really enough space to make it very nice. So make it brief and easy. Keep your notebook right handy. Don't stick it up on your bookshelf. Put it right by the breakfast table, and then keep a pencil. That's all you need, a pencil, a window, and your book. and 12 seconds. You'll learn a lot if you can kind of think like an ecologist and do simple experiments. When I was visiting Barrett one time, we were chatting in his cabin, and I noticed there was just a little movement out the window, and I didn't want to be rude, so I didn't look away from him when we were talking, but when I had an opportunity, I looked out and I realized, oh, there's a chickadee. That's what I'm seeing coming back to me. But then I looked a little more closely, and I don't know if you can see what I saw. What are they?
They're what I used to do, dead mice.
They're dead mice. You've done this experiment. So he put out dead mice, and because he wanted to know what would happen if I put a dead mouse on a stump. Perfectly reasonable experiment question. And what he discovered is when the chickadees were making nests, they loved mouse food. So I think the next thing that probably happened is that a blue jay came and grabbed them and swallowed them. When you mow a lawn, mow half of it, then sit down with some iced tea or a beer or something like that, and watch what happens with the dragonflies and the robins and the other animals, and see what your experiment has, what it's triggered. Make friends who know things about nature that you don't. Some years ago, I was really glad to bump into some members of the Maine Mycological Association. So these are kind of an eccentric seeming group of people who know so much about mushrooms, and it's a delight to go out with them, very welcoming. You can join this organization if you want and go on any of their forays. But they are experts in the local mushrooms, where to find them, what's edible, what's not, what the names are. They're actually as much interested in the obscure, inedible ones as anything, because they just love mushrooms and fungi in general. So what I try to do is challenge myself with a new taxon, a new group of animals or plants every year or two. And I'm saving grasses and sedges for my next life. They're way into encrustose lichens. But I've, I've decided, okay, well, I've pretty much got the birds and the wildflowers and most of the insect groups. So I'm going for mosses or aquatic or spiders or something. Scrutinize, touch, smell, taste, listen, measure. In short, do what Mary Oliver says and just pay attention, be attentive. How else could you know how to distinguish a male versus female Luna moth? The males with their highly feathered antennae for picking up pheromone molecules of distant females. Or what a bear cub smells like. And I'll tell you, it's the most lovely puppy-like smell you can imagine. But these are things that really change your life. And then finally, tell about it. Pass on your knowledge and put it into action. I'll give you one example that happens to tie back into wood frogs of a simple observation I made for my natural history journal that turned out to actually have a policy impact. This is the wood frog satellite. Can you tell which is male and female? Well, you can in this context. Yeah, but males are on top. They're smaller and they're darker brown. Females are big-bellied and kind of chestnut. And that's a leech, Macrorhabditis, one of the biggest North American leeches. It's I believe the same thing as the medicinal leech. And they take advantage of the mating wood frog pairs in what's called an amplexus. But there's another way to sex males, like if you, or sex wood frogs in general, if you don't see them as a pair. Anybody know how which this is, a male or female? Yeah. So males have this muscular thumb, which they use to really lock on the female's back, because there's a lot of competition between males for available females. Males far outnumber females in any given night. And so if you go out and watch them, this takes place, by the way, with the first warm rain, when the ponds have, they're half thawed, there's a place for frogs to get to. So this happens, in Brunswick, it used to be like April 7th was a meeting day. And Harpswell would be probably a little bit earlier than that, late in March. And anyway, that must give a thumb. That's one way to tell. So back to the observation and putting science, putting knowledge to work. A number of years ago, I think, gosh, now I can't remember, was it 2014, something like that, was a particularly huge year for wood frog egg masses. And I've always gone out in a canoe in our pond and just counted them. There are often about 500 egg masses, each with, I don't know, maybe an average of 600 or 700 eggs. And that year, they had high survival, and there were tadpoles everywhere. And I went swimming, actually my wife went swimming, she was the one who came in after swimming at about, she was about 5 in the afternoon in June. And she came back in the house and said, oh my gosh, there were so many tadpoles I was actually touching them while I was swimming. And I went out to swim the next day at midday, and this is what I found. Not one living tadpole. They were all belly up, and it was like, what happened here? It was a catastrophe. It happened within a 20-odd hour period, because we knew they were all alive, and we knew they were all dead. And our pond was isolated, so it wasn't any external source of poisons or anything like that. So I did what we would all do and scooped up a bunch of cadavers and put them in the freezer. And then I got online to find out who in the world knew about amphibian diseases. And it turns out that one of the world's experts is at the University of Tennessee, Matt Gray. So I emailed him and I said, this is what happened. And he said, did you happen to keep any cadavers? And I said, yeah, of course. So he said, send them to me on dry ice. And so he did an analysis and found, he said they were just glowing with something called the ranavirus. So this is sort of a spreading disease from the old world that's actually hitting native populations, not just of wood frogs, but of spotted salamanders. They infect painted turtles and green frogs and bullfrogs, but it's not lethal for them, and it's an absolute killer for wood frogs. So anyway, this led to the easiest publication I ever wrote, sudden mass die-off of a large population of wood frog tadpoles in Maine, likely due to coronavirus. But the interesting thing is that now the Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, Maine Fisheries and Wildlife, which has a big community science program of people going out to vernal pools and counting egg masses, now sends people back out at the time when the tadpoles are metamorphosing and leaving the pond to make sure they haven't been decimated by this coronavirus.
When you called it old world, what did you mean by that?
Oh, I'm sorry, just from Europe or Asia.
Okay, so it was a migrant virus.
I think it came over with Xenopus, which is a lab frog used in biomedical research and other kinds of research, which is from Africa, African clawed frog. And then it spread to native populations. But it really is a conservation concern. I mean, I get emails still years later from people who say, same thing happened in my pond in upstate New York or Ontario. I want to show you another data set to kind of give you a little bit of a warning of the dangers of being too observant in terms of your emotional state. This is some observations I did at the Bowdoin Scientific Station on Kent Island, where we have a population of tree swallows nesting in artificial boxes. And they look like this. They're spread out in kind of grid over the field. And every year we count them. And we started when my kids were really young. And this is my daughter getting a little bit older and helping me out, and continued until she went to college. And this is what it looked like when I started the study in 1987. There were 100 boxes, and every single one was filled with a pair of tree swallows. And this is what they said. feel my heart breaking every year. And then this graph I made, before 2012, but we pretty much stopped the study then, but then it's only been 1 to 3 pairs since then. Actually, I shouldn't say that. I've been told that in the last couple of years there's a little bit of an uptick, and I think I've seen that locally too. But this is maybe your experience with barn swallows here, penny swallows, purple martins. There are a lot of whippoorwills. All the aerial insect-eating birds have really taken a hit. And that brings me to this point. I just saw this quotation in an op-ed piece just the other day. One of the penalties of ecological education for being an observant naturalist is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. Sometimes feel like wounds. But here's a big wound for me and for anybody who's concerned about birds or enjoys birds. Since I graduated from high school in 1970, the number of birds in North America, and in fact probably close worldwide, has declined 30% at least. And it's not just that we've lost 1/3 of our birds, but the liveliness of birds has changed, because picture what happens with birds. First thing in the morning during the breeding season, a male gives a song to challenge any other male who may have come into his territory, and now it's silent, because the next redstart or wood thrush is a couple hundred yards away. So he gives 1 or 2 songs and goes, okay, well, I'm good. Whereas 30 years ago, or 50 years ago rather, there was just so much more bird song. So this is very personal for me. This is my first pair of binoculars. And this is my first bird book. I wrote my name up here, N-A-T, but that's as much writing as I was either able or willing to do, so my mother wrote the little. But this is what I learned how to recognize birds by their silhouettes on fence posts and wires. I now sometimes drive up to Rangeley, which I like to go in the summer and spring, and it's, I think, 120 miles in each direction, and I do for fun a sort of a masochistic survey of birds on wires, and sometimes it's 0.
Do we know why? Do we know why?
All the usual culprits. It's mostly sprawl, and I feel very strongly about it. It has to be pesticides, either direct or indirect. It will soon be climate change, but I don't think that's going to pile on. But that's not really what's caused this 50-year decline, because that should just mean that southern birds should move north, which is what is happening. But something else. Basically, it's contamination of some kind. It's also cats, and it's bird strikes on windows. Yeah.
How much of it is reforestation? I know that when I was young, say here as you, there were many more fields, many more active farms in New England specifically. So there's many fewer of those now, and the bird species change quite dramatically.
Yeah, so true. So that would predict we'd have more wood thrushes, right? Because you're saying that these fields grown up. But across the board, it's true, grassland bird species are among the most hardest hit, but there are also tons and tons of woodland species. And as I mentioned, the aerial insect-eating birds.
But we have more raptors now because of the protections.
Yes. Oh, yeah, and there's some great news on turkeys, bird and falcons. I mean, I genuinely mean that about turkeys. Some really charismatic birds like bald eagles.
But more raptors has an impact on their prey species.
Yeah. And there are some good news stories. Moose, well, actually not in the last 10 years so much, but moose really recovered from our childhood. So
a lot of the raptors are carrying in, there's a lot more death, and some of the poison and that sort of thing is the problem. But the bugs, the lack of bugs on our windshields, and the fact that 50 or 60 years, chemicals waging a war as an enemy in your backyard of insects has just taken on popularity that's now, it's not even in social consciousness anymore. That's a bad thing to do.
yeah. Oh, I would love to see Brunswick and Topsham and Harpswell have municipal ordinances regulating the poisons that people put on their yards.
Amen.
So You know, we almost have a quorum here. You know, honestly, seriously, if every single person here were one email to your town council, they would pay attention to say, we've got to regulate this. Oh no, I go to Lowe's and I see 40-pound sacks of broad spectrum poisons. People are spreading to protect themselves, I think, from ticks, and so forth. So I think that's where these words are on. But I do, you know, the world never really quite looked like this. But I think each one of those birds I saw doing what's here, and often you see, you know, 5 or 6 of the times. So it is a very personal thing. But then I read a little farther that Aldo Leopold quotation, actually it's 2 sentences later, and ecologists must either harden, forgive the gender aspect here, and ecologists must either harden his shell and make believe that the consequences of science are none of his business, or he must be the doctor. So that's my challenge to you, to be the doctor. And that gets to my last part here. And the new part, and this is a project that I got inspired to do. Someone sent me a link to a talk by Doug Tallamy. Does anybody know Doug Tallamy? Do you know of him?
He's an amazing guy.
Well, he gave a PowerPoint. I've seen 1,000 PowerPoints. I've given 1,000 PowerPoints. He did such an amazing job. It just knocked my socks out about the importance of rewilding your lawn. And I've also even lectured about not mowing your lawn, letting wildflowers come in, but he just did it in such a persuasive way. And he's written a series of books, one of them called Bringing Nature Home. Maine Audubon, by the way, is really promoting Bringing Nature Home. And then the other thing, this connected me with the Wild Seed Project in Portland. Heather McCargo, the previous executive director, who has been tremendous.
He's got another spectacular book on oak.
Yeah,
Oak trees.
the importance of
It's unbelievable, the level of detail in science in that book.
Yeah. It says that you can plant one genus, that genus, and also golden moths. So my project is, okay, I've seen insects decline, moths are not around my lights in the summer like they used to be, birds are declining as a result of not having as much food. What can I do in my backyard? And this is looking from our house out in a little field, and unfortunately this is the only before picture I have of this field. But it's your standard hay pasture, although in this case it actually had a lot of bittersweet and other invasive plants, and it was a big pain. It took me one summer just to get rid of the shrubby invasive vines and other plants. But then it was just a grassy meadow, and my aim was to take this, which has a very small number of species, none of them native to North America, and turn it into something that looks like this, and that attracts black swallowtails and other native insect species as pollinators and as herbivores. So some of you may know my neighbor, Sam Alexander. He was kind enough to come over from his farm, drive through the woods. His tractor actually took different tractors because he plowed, he harrowed, and he smoothed this field. He said it probably hadn't been plowed in 150 years. And then I did what Heather McCargo suggested I do. The next step, and by the way, I'm going to tell you a fairly complicated way to turn your lawn into a wildflower meadow. You may not want to do all of this, and that's fine. The other way to do is just stop mowing and let it grow up. The problem with it is that 60% of the species that will be there, which look nice and flower, will be from Europe and Asia. Not just dandelions, but hawkweeds and chickweeds, and But that's okay. It's more diverse. It's attracting pollinators. It's all good. But if you really want to make it more like a native wildflower, you've got to get rid of the grasses. And one of the steps is to plant a cover crop to shade out all the seeds that are now exposed once you plow it. So this is now looking in the opposite direction from that first picture in the field. And I sowed, after he finished smoothing it, I sowed it in the bucket in the early spring. And this is what it looked like later. This is what I've been told to do. To be perfectly honest, the cover crop didn't get the job done. There were lots of grasses, lots of dandelions, lots of other stuff afterwards. And what got the job done was black plastic. So I didn't like to use it, my neighbors didn't like to look at it, but if you put black plastic down in summer for a month, then that will do it. A month and a half it might take. So, year one, plowed it, planted cover crop, put down black.
Not a lot of turkeys and
Plastic.
deer with buckwheat though.
Well, that's where the scarecrow came in.
You can't stop them from getting in buckwheat.
So then, at the end of the season, I mowed it again, and here I am mixing a bag of seed that I ordered from Prairie Moon Nursery in Minnesota with 70 Maine native species in it. And what you're supposed to do is mix it with sawdust. So you have a great volume, like, a contractor's bag worth of sawdust for that much seed. And what that does is that allows you to cast the seed out fairly uniformly over there. So you're sort of diluting it. And what you want to do is wait until there's a little bit of snow on the ground with a heavy snowstorm forecast. Again, I'm telling you the difficult way to do this. You don't have to do this, but if you want to turn it into just a pure native wildflower meadow, that's kind of what you have to do. So here I am spreading the seeds this last January, and I actually got two different seed mixes. One is for full sun and one is for partial shade, because there are a whole bunch of maple trees along the edge and it's much shadier, so I had a different assemblage of species. And that's what it looked like in the spring. You can see I didn't get all the grasses, but it's coming up now. Actually, to be honest, there were lots of oxalis, it's called, and a hedge nettle, which are both sort of weedy species. But so here I am with black plastic to see if I can kill some more of the grasses. I took 5% of the seeds because they were fairly expensive, and decided, well, as a backup, I'm going to build myself a rodent-proof kind of suitcase with hardware cloth. And I planted, I had something like 500 plugs of soil, and I just scattered the seeds on them. I couldn't tell, again, there's 70 species in this bag, and I couldn't really tell who was who. So I just kind of spread it in there thinly. But they all germinated. You can see it's really quite lush. And I had all these plugs. Now here I deviated from what the Wild Seed Project recommended that I do, and I think it was a great move as it turned out. Their recommendation is to take these plugs after they germinate them, put them in a big pot, and then put them out and let them grow all summer until you have a great big vigorous plant. Well, I didn't have space for 500 great big vigorous plants, and I didn't want to water 500 great big vigorous plants. I didn't want to dig a hole at the end of the summer for them. So I said, I'm going to shortcut the system. I'm going to just take a little spade, stick it in the ground, wedge it open, and pop these plugs in. And I just went through the field, put in 500 plugs. It didn't take that long. And they actually took. So here's what it looks like. Yeah, so and I have no idea what these are. Well, I have some of them. I think this Rudbeckia is but they're native grasses and everything just popped up. And I did have some that I did put into pots, but I will tell you, it was a pain in the neck digging holes for this. Anyway, the plugs worked great. Even in this dry summer, I hardly watered them. They were fine. But here's some of my difficult areas where I put black plastic. This was good for that. Here's some more of my little plugs. So just to summarize, year one was plow out smooth, shade the weeds, either cover crop or sow ride. Year two, sow the seeds in the winter.